Hi everyone. In my last video I did mention that this next video is going to be about self-compassion and why lots of people don't have self-compassion or they struggle with it. But that's going to be a bit of a bigger project than I was anticipating, so that one will come a bit later. So in the meantime I'll do a couple of other videos. So in this video I'd like to talk about narcissists and empathy. So one of the diagnostic criteria for having narcissistic personality disorder is that there's a lack of empathy. So I'd like to go and read an article from my website. The article is called Narcissistic Personality Disorder and Empathy, and my website is called childrenofnarcissists.org.uk. if you'd like to go and have a look at it over there. So let's go and have a look at my article, Narcissists and Empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It helps us to establish relationships with others and to resolve conflicts and misunderstandings. It can encourage self-reflection, altruism, forgiveness, cooperation, and personal growth. And the more empathic we are, the stronger our sense of well-being. Some people might disagree with that, and they might say, I'm an empath and they feel too much, but then that might be when we're out of balance with ourselves. So this is something that can be worked on. So empathy and boundaries, so being more boundaried, because sometimes we have really porous boundaries and we over-empathize with other people and we feel too much what other people are feeling. And this in itself is a survival technique. But if we have a healthy level of empathy that's boundaried, then we're going to have a stronger sense of well-being. The complex relationship between narcissists and empathy. How empathy develops. Empathy involves the ability to recognize and understand another person's perspective and how they are feeling. For a child, it usually emerges within the second year of life, and its development greatly depends on the nature of the relationships in the child's family home and with their caregivers. Innate characteristics are also a factor here. So empathy is shaped by nature and nurture. So we're born with a certain character, and then this is shaped by events in the world. Babies' social interactions begin mainly with a primary caregiver, and the empathic capabilities of the caregiver are crucial for a secure and healthy attachment style to develop. So there's a link then to attachment theory, an article on that, which is really helpful to understand in how we're shaped and how we come out of a narcissistic household. When children have developed a secure attachment style, they are more responsive to the needs of others and are less hostile to out-group members and more empathic towards people in need. From the perspective of neuroscience, there are two main subdivisions of empathy, which are emotional, i.e. the responses to facial expressions and what the other person is saying, and cognitive. So that's the understanding of mental states, so things like beliefs, desires, and knowledge. And these enable an individual to explain and predict others' behaviour. Types of empathy. There are different types of empathy. So cognitive empathy involves knowing how other people think and feel. Emotional empathy involves feeling another person's emotions. Compassionate empathy involves sympathy and compassion for another. Somatic empathy involves having a physical reaction in response to what someone else is experiencing. So like feeling pain when seeing another person in pain. Somatic means the body. And affective empathy involves the ability to understand another person's emotions and then respond appropriately. So next I'm going to quote from an article where a study was done on people with narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is associated with an assortment of characteristics that undermine interpersonal functioning. A lack of empathy is often cited as the primary distinguishing feature of NPD. However, clinical presentations of NPD suggest that empathy is not simply deficient in these individuals, but dysfunctional and subject to a diverse set of motivational and situational factors. So especially the motivational factors, they're really important in that. Given the complexity of narcissism and empathy, multiple relationships can exist between these constructs. Ultimately, by recognizing the multifaceted relationship between empathy and narcissism and moving away from an all or nothing belief that those with NPD simply lack empathy, therapists may better understand narcissistic patients' behavior and motivational structure. Clinical research efforts using self-report and interview measures have failed to identify a lack of empathy as a distinguishing characteristic in patients with NPD. This accumulation of evidence spurred the description of empathic dysfunction to change from the inability to recognise how others feel, which was the definition in the DSM-3, to the unwillingness to recognise or identify with the feelings and needs of others in the DSM-4. So the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Some narcissistic individuals may have intact empathic ability but choose to disengage from others' pain or distress, while others may have a deficient ability in the recognition of others' feelings. For NPD, the following conceptualization of empathic functioning was suggested. So this is a definition. Impaired ability to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others, excessively attuned to reactions of others, but only if perceived as relevant to the self, and over or underestimating of their own effects on others. Although the experimental research on empathy and narcissism is limited, generally it indicates a stronger deficit in emotional rather than cognitive empathy. Research using self-report questionnaires that measure components of empathy reports that individuals high on narcissism report lower levels of perspective taking on the interpersonal reactivity index, particularly in response to questions that assess willingness to engage in empathic concern. Conversely, narcissistic individuals tend to overestimate their capacity for emotional empathy. This pattern may indicate that narcissistic individuals, as suggested above, have a motivation-based impairment in the cognitive empathic functioning in addition to compromised emotional empathy. So motivation being the important word there. So they mentioned the interpersonal reactivity index there, and they were speaking about the questions that were to do with perspective taking. So let's have a look at a couple of those questions. So a question would be there: I sometimes find it difficult to see things from the other guy's point of view. I try to look at everybody's side of a disagreement before I make a decision. I believe that there are two sides to every question and try to look at them both. And when I'm upset at someone, I usually try to put myself in his shoes for a while. So for people with narcissistic personality disorder, then they're scoring very low on those questions. So it's not important to them. Individuals with pathological narcissism may be capable of processing affective information, but don't want to engage in empathic processing so as to not lose control or appear vulnerable. So this is really important to them. Combined with their inability to respond to others' emotions, this may leave narcissistic individuals at a loss for how to connect with others and manage interpersonal interactions. People with NPD in their grandiose state may, like psychopathic individuals, possess the cognitive capacity to utilize empathy, but have a motivation-based desire to disengage from empathic processing. Such disengagement is likely to co-occur with grandiose strivings that stem from idealized or enhanced experiences, internal grandiose fantasies, or a need to promote self-serving behavior. In such situations, empathic engagement with other people's problems can be counterintuitive to the narcissistic individual's needs for self-centered avoidance or enhancement. So basically, they disengage from their empathy because they want to pursue their needs and their wants and their selfish interests, even if they're at the expense of other people. So choosing not to engage in empathy. So that's an extract from an article written by Ariel Baskin-Summers and Elizabeth Cruz-Mark and Elsa Roningstam, and they're at the Harvard Medical School and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Empathy and the brain. So there was a study conducted by Universitätsmedizin Berlin. Researchers analysed the brains of 34 subjects using magnetic resonance imaging, so MRI scan, methods, and 17 individuals had a diagnosis of NPD and 17 did not. The research has identified a structural abnormality in the brains of those with NPD, specifically noting less volume of grey matter in the left anterior insula. This brain region relates to empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. In the subjects with NPD, the anterior insula and white matter was found to be abnormal, as was the cerebral cortex, so that is the thinking and reasoning part of the brain. And these structures are involved in the processing and generation of compassion for others. So interestingly, there's a book by an author called Sue Gerhardt, and the book is called Love Matters. And in that book, she writes about the work done with Romanian orphans that showed that those that were left in their cots all day and had minimal contact with caregivers had a virtual black hole where the orbitofrontal cortex should be. So that was in the time of when I think contraception was banned in Romania, and there were lots of Romanian orphans, or abortion was banned rather, in Romania. And there were lots of Romanian orphans, mothers that didn't want to look after their children for whatever reason. And there were many Romanian orphanages, and they were abysmal. I'm sure they all weren't abysmal, but a lot of them were really abysmal. There were horrendous stories of children being left in cots all day, hardly spoken to, tied in those cots. They had no stimulation whatsoever, and it was absolutely horrendous. And some of them were left like that for months and years. So they did brain scans on those people, and that's where they found this information from, which is really important and significant in showing how our brain development can be affected in abusive situations. So the orbitofrontal cortex is the area which is responsible for inhibiting responses, learning changes in contingency, emotional appraisal, altering behaviour through somatic markers, and driving social behaviour, among other processes. So a baby needs input from the environment to develop this area of the brain. And the book as well is called Why Love Matters. So children need love, don't they? Love, affection, care, nurturing, all those emotions. And when those are absent, then it's heavily influential on the baby and affects the baby and the growing child, and then affects them into adulthood. So we have the fallout from growing up in that kind of childhood in adulthood until we can heal from what happened and understand ourselves better. People with NPD may therefore have had their brain growth and development affected from childhood onwards, which may have resulted in deficiencies in empathy. Brain growth and development are affected in all individuals from dysfunctional backgrounds, so that in itself is not a satisfactory explanation for deficiencies in empathy. Mirror neurons in the brain. Another element to empathy is the brain-body response to others, which is known as the mirror neuron system. This was first discovered in monkeys when it was observed that a group of neurons that fires when a monkey performs an action also fires when it observes the same action being performed by another animal. So that's really interesting. So we have a group of neurons firing in our brains when we do something, and then also when we watch someone else doing it, the same neurons fire. So this is going to give us a connection to and an understanding of what that person's feeling. It was subsequently found that in humans, mirror neurons fire even while observing meaningless movements. So that's also really interesting. The more people tend to imitate each other, the more they are able to develop an empathic relationship. Social mirroring involves the interaction of the core mirror neuron system with the limbic system. So that's like the mammalian brain, which supports a variety of functions, including emotion, behavior, and long-term memory. Mirroring can also be seen when people mirror each other's body postures or yawn and smile when they see others do so. As yet, the mirror neuron system cannot be accurately measured in humans. And it would be interesting to see the results of brain scans of people with NPD, if and when it becomes possible, to give us more sight into the disorder. Yeah, that'd be really interesting, wouldn't it, if we could see what happened with those neurons. And then again, that might be complicated because there could be intent and desire involved in that as well. So if we don't want to be feeling empathic towards someone else, then maybe that's going to influence if those neurons fire or not. I'm not really an expert in those kind of things, but, very interesting. The influence of attachment on empathy. Each individual with NPD is different, but as a general rule, it seems that people with NPD choose not to engage with others empathically. They have not had an attuned caregiver and have a disorganized or avoidant attachment style, which means there is an avoidance of closeness, intimacy, and being dependent in relationships. John Bowlby was a psychoanalyst who researched the relationships between babies and young children and their primary caregivers, usually the mother, and he believed that early problems in that relationship led to mental health issues and behavioural problems in later life. He linked narcissistic disorders to dismissing avoidant attachment styles derived from attachment figures being consistently rejecting and or emotionally unavailable. So this predisposed the individual to attempt to live his life without the love and support of others. So really trying to live a life without being dependent on anyone else, rejecting of other people also. And those are the words from a lecture by Diana Diamond. She's a specialist in narcissistic personality disorder and personality disorders in general. She's really an authority on personality disorders, and I think she's the head of the Personality Disorders Institute somewhere. I can't remember where it is off the top of my head. She's American, so somewhere in America. John Bowlby as well, his childhood is very interesting if you want to look that up. So he was born into the, I think, upper classes or at least the upper middle classes in the UK in early last century, and he was brought up by nannies. He spent 1 hour a day with his mother. I think the attitude at the time was that if you spent too much time with your children, you would spoil them. And he was sent to boarding school when he was 7, and his opinion on that was that he wouldn't send a dog to boarding school at 7. So he was massively affected by and interested in attachment and what happens in the early years with the relationship between a child and the mother. I think one of his conclusions that he drew was that there had to be consistent care for the first 2 years from that primary caregiver, from the mother, for the child to have a secure attachment, and there shouldn't be any long separations there. And then the mother has to be good enough. So, yeah, she has to be able to empathise with her baby and to give attention and nurturing to the baby. So his opinion that then is that people with narcissistic disorders have this kind of attachment style. And I'll go into that a bit further as well, Diana Diamond's comments on attachment styles in a few minutes. People with NPD do have a dependency on narcissistic supply, which they need to glean from their relationships with others. So narcissistic supply is kind of a feeding of themselves, a feeding of that self-esteem. It's like a balloon that's leaking that always needs to be inflated constantly with narcissistic supply. So they need to glean narcissistic supply from their relationships with others, but this need is not achieved through a psychologically intimate closeness with another. It is achieved through having their grandiose image of themselves reinforced by being mirrored back to them and through them feeling that they are admired. So they want people around them to admire them and praise them and give them attention, and that can even be negative attention sometimes. It doesn't always need to be that positive attention. Each narcissist is different. People with NPD wish to be emotionally distant from others and exist without their love and support, but are reliant on others for admiration to regulate their self-esteem. So that's the position that they find themselves in, that they're operating on the premise that they're better than everyone else and they don't need anyone else, but they need people to regulate their self-esteem. So this makes things complicated. So they need to kind of keep people engaged with them, or some people they keep engaged with them, others like their scapegoat. Children, for example, that's a different kind of relationship, but also serves a purpose. So onto their scapegoat child, they can project things, they can project the stuff in themselves that they don't want to acknowledge or recognize. Narcissistic rage, the fight response. So narcissists commonly go into rages. They're very quick to anger. People with NPD are very quick to anger. This is the fight response. And this response is characterized by anger, aggression, suspicion, rage, indifference, and haughty behaviors, which do not coexist with empathy and compassion for others. So they find themselves there a lot, don't they? So this is because actually they want to get the environment to resonate with themselves and their needs. So if someone's not admiring them and not mirroring back to them their grandiose image, then they can go into a rage. They can go quiet for weeks or days, which is when they go into silent treatment, when they go into that devaluing mode. So they're devaluing of others who don't reflect back to them what they want to be reflected back to them. So Diana Diamond, PhD, master lecture. So I've put a link in the article to the YouTube video, and then I'll also put links in the description below to things that you might find helpful or want to watch. And Diana Diamond, in her master lecture on NPD, states that parental figures of people with NPD are cold but over-involved and are abusive and neglectful. She also mentions that this view is controversial, as there has been one empirical, which means observed rather than theory, study which does not link parental behaviour to the development of NPD, but there have been 2 studies which do link the two, as well as a lot of anecdotal evidence of the parent using the child as an extension of themselves. So it's about the parent and it's not about the child. In terms of empathy, people with NPD have intact cognitive empathy and theory of mind, but they are very deficient in affective empathy or attunement to others. Theory of mind refers to the ability to attribute mental states to oneself and others, understanding that others have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are different from one's own. And understanding this is important as it provides the ability to predict and interpret the behaviours of others. So, very interesting. So they can understand intellectually what people are feeling and thinking. They have a good theory of mind, so they understand those concepts because they need to have those things in order to be able to get narcissistic supply from people. So they can't be emotionally incompetent. They're going to be really aware of how to get that narcissistic supply. In terms of intimacy, their relationships are superficial. They exist to serve self-esteem regulation. There is little genuine interest in others' experiences, and there's a predominance of need for personal gain. So it's all about what they want, isn't it? And there is difficulty recognizing or identifying with feelings and needs of others, And there's excessive attunement to reactions in others, but only if perceived as relevant to the self. And emotional regulation mirrors fluctuations in self-esteem. So really interesting there that they don't attune to others unless they want to. So they do when it's relevant to them. So really it is highly motivated by their underlying desires and their wants and needs and what they want to achieve from their relationships and from their lives. In terms of self-direction, so self-direction is the ability and tendency to act without being told what to do. Goal setting is based on gaining approval from others, and their personal standards are either unreasonably high in order to see oneself as exceptional, or they are too low based on a sense of entitlement. So my standards are low, but I'm amazing, so I can do what I want, basically. Yeah, so each person with NPD is an individual, and they're going to have different variation. They're going to have their own version of their personal standards. Personal standards being too low can mean that, and here she says, Diana Diamond says, this gets to what we used to call the superego. So the superego is the part of the mind, this is from Freudian theory, which incorporates the values and morals of society, which are learned from one's parents and others. So this is what we used to call superego pathology of these patients, but I think we can just say that there are deficiencies in the realm of moral values. So really, really important there that there's deficiency in the realm of moral values. So they have their own set of moral values, which it revolves around meeting their own needs, getting the narcissistic supply, and being entitled to do what they want. So, conclusion, narcissism and empathy. So in summary, individuals with pathological narcissism may be capable of processing affective information, but don't want to engage in empathic processing so as not to lose control or appear vulnerable. So they have the capability, but as a defense mechanism against losing control of others or appearing vulnerable or weak, then they choose not to. There is an unwillingness rather than an inability to be empathic. So that's from the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. The grandiose nature of NPD and the need to devalue others is incompatible with empathy and compassion. So the very definition, really, of NPD is going to be that they need to devalue others to stay in a grandiose position. Other people have to be less than them. And in that master lecture as well, Diana Diamond also says, when she's talking about a patient that she had with NPD, they said that your success is my failure. Something along those lines. So it's painful for them in a way that other people are successful. So this goes a long way to explaining why they criticize their children so much and devalue their children so much. And that then their children go on to develop patterns of self-sabotaging or being mediocre or underachieving. So not only is it because they're dealing with the fallout from growing up with a narcissistic parent, they also need to not achieve more than their parent or not invoke their parents' jealousy. So narcissistic parents are incredibly competitive and jealous. So that's really interesting. In a self-reported study using the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, a questionnaire which measures empathy, people with NPD scored lower levels on perspective taking, which is the tendency to spontaneously adopt the psychological point of view of others. There may be issues with brain development in the area responsible for empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. For example, Bessel van der Kolk, who has a book called The Body Keeps the Score, he did brain scans on people with trauma, and they found that the amygdala was swollen. in people that have trauma, and that's in the mammalian part of the brain, and it's the fire alarm of the brain. So it's the part that alerts us to danger. So that's having more resources devoted to it when someone's growing up, when they need to be hyper aware, hyper vigilant of their environment, because there's a lot of danger around. So that shows how brain development is affected. Relationships exist to serve self-esteem regulation. So closeness and intimacy are not desired. So empathy is kind of superfluous. It's not needed. There are deficiencies in the realm of moral values, which means there's no need for empathy. Or empathy would be a handicap to what someone with NPD desires to achieve. So it's another reason why they're not empathic. So people with NPD know how others think and feel and score highly in social cognition, but are deficient in responding appropriately or attuning to others, although they can be excessively attuned to the reactions in others when those reactions are relevant to themselves, which would suggest that they have the ability to attune when desired. So people with NPD are not interested in the lives of others. They wish to exist without the love and support of others. They need to devalue others to maintain their position of superiority and grandiosity, yet they also need to keep others on side so that they can maintain access to narcissistic supply and the approval of others to bolster their self-esteem. So that is narcissists and empathy, and this is why they can be so cold and callous and cruel. Because there's also, as well, I think, for many narcissists, or certainly the malignant ones, there's a desire to win at all costs. So empathy is going to be a handicap in being able to achieve that dominance. It's a dominance over the people around them as much as they can. Yeah. So they want to win at all costs, and they also want to get what they want and get what they need. And there's entitlement there as well. So this is why they're so dark. Many narcissists are so dark and so difficult to be around because of these elements, and because they don't engage in empathy, which is a basic need in a relationship, is that we have empathy for others and that we can relate to others and be close to others in that way. So very interesting, I think, and it helps to know these things because it helps to have more of an insight into the mindset of someone with narcissistic personality disorder. So especially if we're closely involved with them, if we have a narcissistic parent or a narcissistic partner, then this is going to help us to get more understanding of why they are the way that they are. Because so many people end up blaming themselves for what's happened to them for many reasons. So I have a video on that, why we blame ourselves. And incredibly painful to be a child of someone who doesn't want to engage in empathy for their own child. So a bit depressing, that video. So I hope that was interesting and useful for you, and you learned something from that, and that if you didn't know that already, it's going to help you to understand what you've been through and also understand yourself better, because that was a situation. You had a parent or a partner who didn't engage in empathy, and you weren't nurtured as a baby or a small child or a teenager in the way that you needed to be, because it's all about the narcissist and their needs. So that's that. Take care of yourselves and see you in the next one. Bye.